Hi everyone, I'm Holly from the Wildlife Conservation Society. I'm the Sharks and Rays Advisor for the Southeast Asia Archipelago. And I'm here today to explore some of the complexities of controlling shark and ray trade in a supply country, Indonesia, to argue that legality alone isn't going to be enough to stem the overexploitation of sharks and rays, and to give you some examples of the work that WCS is doing in the field to deal with some of these issues. So, overexploitation represents a significant threat to wildlife, with the severest impacts felt by slow-growing, long-lived species that are traded for their non-perishable, economically valuable body parts. And unfortunately, many shark and ray species tick all of these criteria. They've been increasingly exploited in recent decades to meet emerging demand for a range of consumer products. Shark fin soup is the obvious one, it's the one that we all think about, but there's a bunch of other products too. So meat is consumed in some countries, liver oil, and shark products are also ingredients in cosmetics and in traditional Chinese medicine. It's difficult to measure, but it's estimated now that annual global fishing mortality of sharks exceeds the average rebound rate of many shark and ray species, which explains why, over the last decade, we've seen gradual declines in the annual capture production of sharks and rays, which is a sign that global populations are now overexploited. And it's estimated that now 1 in 4 shark and ray species are threatened with extinction. This makes them one of the most threatened species groups in the world. Sharks and rays are also receiving increasing international attention. They're seen as important and charismatic species. So sharks are apex predators, which means they play important roles in maintaining functional and productive ocean ecosystems. And as society is gradually recovering from the psychological scars of the movie Jaws, people are now less scared of sharks and increasingly seeing them as cool species. So there's both growing professional interest and public sentiment towards conserving sharks and rays. And this is reflected in a couple of international policy decisions to confer greater protection to shark and ray species. So, for example, under the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. At the 16th Conference of the Parties in 2013, we had a raft of new shark and ray species added to CITES Appendix II. And this means that countries are obliged to ensure that trade in these species is non-detrimental to wild populations of those species. So we had oceanic whitetip, hammerhead sharks, poor beagle shark and manta rays added to Appendix II at COP16. And then at the most recent COP, just in November last year, we had thresher sharks, silky sharks and devil rays added to Appendix II. So that's a sign that internationally people are starting to care about shark and ray conservation. Within this international context, Indonesia is a global priority for shark and ray conservation and management, because it's both a hotspot of diversity and a hotspot of threat. So Indonesia lies at the heart of the Coral Triangle, which is a mega diverse region for marine fauna and a hotspot for shark endemism. At the same time, Indonesia is the world's biggest shark fishery. And this fishing pressure seems to be taking its toll on species, with an estimated 40% of shark species occurring in Indonesian waters threatened with extinction. This makes Indonesia one of the highest relative extinction risk regions for sharks in the world, which is why you can see that bright red blob around Indonesia there on the map. So this all sounds quite concerning, but there's also growing momentum within Indonesia to do something about this. So the government have developed a national plan of action for sharks. They've also declared some shark sanctuaries to protect habitat for sharks. And there's a number of species that have recently been given full protection status within Indonesia. So the government want to do something about this, except implementation is incredibly challenging in Indonesia. That's in part because it's a vast country with an enormous coastline. Also because, as always, environmental ministries are dramatically under-resourced. But crucially, there's huge ecological and socio-economic complexities associated with conserving and managing sharks and rays, some of which I'm going to talk you through just now. So, we tend to lump sharks and rays together into this homogeneous species group, but they're actually a huge and diverse group of species. In Indonesia alone, there's more than 200 species of sharks and rays, and they range from manta rays, which are large, slow-growing and slow-reproducing, vulnerable to fishing pressure because they're often found in shallow and coastal waters, and they have high economic value. On the other hand, we've got things like this little guy. This is a pygmy shark. These are much smaller, have got a much higher reproductive rate. They're less vulnerable to fishing because they're deep water species, and they have a negligible economic value. And this diversity of species is also going to require a diversity of management approaches. The spatial dynamics are also really complex. So sharks inhabit the largest and least explored ecosystem in the world, ocean ecosystems. Now, that might sound like a kind of trivial statement, but within these ecosystems, sharks and rays can move huge distances, not only across the surface of the ocean, but also in terms of depth. And there's relatively few physical barriers to their movements, so they're able to move across jurisdictional boundaries and between different countries. To give you one example, some research that Conservation International have been doing in the Bird's Head seascape in Indonesia has shown that whale sharks can dive more than a mile below the surface of the ocean and travel to locations up to 1,000 miles away and back again. And all of these movements seem to be quite random, with each whale shark just choosing to go wherever it feels like going. So this creates a research challenge. It's difficult to understand the behaviour and the population dynamics of sharks and understand what's going on. At the same time, it creates a species protection challenge, because traditional approaches to species protection, like protected areas, have got limited utility for many shark and ray species. The human uses and values are also diverse and conflicting. So, as I said earlier, Indonesia is the world's biggest shark fishery. There's more than 170 shark fisheries scattered throughout the country, and these employ thousands of people. And the estimated export value of this industry is more than 125 million US dollars. So the shark fishery is big business in Indonesia. On the other hand, Indonesia is one of the most popular destinations in the world for marine-based and dive tourism. There's at least 10 million tourists per year, and a study that we did this year estimated that the annual value of shark and ray tourism is around 18 million US dollars per year. And this is only set to grow as the Indonesian government is pushing nature-based tourism as a source of income and sustainable development for the country. So we've got these conflicting uses. On the one hand, we've got consumptive use, and on the one hand, we've got non-consumptive use. And the people who benefit from the consumptive use, the fishers, are not the same as the people who benefit from the non-consumptive use, the tourism industry. And managing these competing interests and trade-offs is incredibly difficult. And unfortunately, current species-focused policies that focus on, for example, just protecting hammerheads, aren't working for a number of practical reasons. So, at the fisheries level, shark fishing is largely non-selective. Even in targeted shark fisheries, fishermen use non-selective fishing gears such as long lines, which are these huge, huge long fishing lines with hundreds and hundreds of hooks attached to them. The fishers go out to their fishing grounds, they chuck the fishing gear over the side of the boat, they leave it to soak for several hours, and then they haul it back up again, by which time the catch is dead. So the fishermen have very limited ability to decide which species catch on to their hooks. When you also consider that a huge proportion, potentially the global majority of shark catch, is actually incidental catch in non-target fisheries, so for example in gillnet fisheries or longline tuna fisheries, makes you realise that fishers basically have little to no ability to pick and choose which species they catch. Moving on to the trade level. So because shark products are often traded in the form of processed, chopped up body parts, and because there's high morphological similarity between protected and non-protected species, species-specific trade monitoring is incredibly difficult. So this picture here is some shark product. It's shark bodies with the head and the fins and the tail removed, ready for export. Does anybody here want to hazard a guess as to whether this is legal or not legal, protected, CITES listed? Any ideas? No, I have absolutely no idea either. And so that gives you an example of the kind of challenges the government faces when it comes to species-specific trade monitoring. There's no way to tell what species a product is, in many cases, without costly and time-consuming genetic testing. And finally, at the consumer level, there's also no species-specific preferences. It's all just shark. It's just shark fin soup. The customers, A, don't care what species is in their shark fin soup, and B, have no ability to tell whether the fin that they're consuming is from threatened and protected hammerheads or from sustainably caught blue shark. So all these challenges throughout the supply chain make species-specific measures really difficult. Within Indonesia, we also have huge ethical concerns when it comes to managing shark and ray fisheries. So shark fishing often takes place in relatively poor coastal communities, and often there are limited sustainable, legal, marine-based alternatives that offer similar financial returns to shark fishing. So this graph here is from one of our project sites in Lombok. You can see people who are engaged in the shark industry, that's the blue one, have got a significantly higher household income than people who are engaged in the non-shark industry. To give another example from eastern Indonesia, when the price fell out of the shark fin market a few years ago, many shark fishers in these communities actually turned to highly risky people smuggling and human trafficking activities, so taking people in boats across to Australia, because there was nothing else that they could do, nothing else available that offered similar financial returns to shark fishing. It's also worth pointing out at this point that it's not all just about the economics. As with any career, people aren't just in it for the money. Like us, conservationists, we're not just in it for the money, otherwise we certainly wouldn't be doing it. And you can see this guy here, he's proudly holding up his catch. And often shark fishing is tied to people's culture, self-identity, family history, and so it's not just about providing people with alternative streams of income, it's also fundamentally tied to who they are, and often they don't want to change even if profits fall. And to bring CITES back into this socio-economic context, so in some fisheries, CITES listed species make up a huge proportion of the catch. So this again is from one of our project sites in Lombok, and you can see that more than half of the catch is made up of CITES listed species. And as I said earlier, the fishermen have very limited ability to choose whether or not they catch these species. The bright red segment, the 44%, that's species that have just been listed on CITES Appendix II at the last conference of the parties. And at the moment, there's no regulations in place for these species in Indonesia because there was a 12-month implementation delay at the COP. But within the next couple of months, the Indonesian government is going to be obliged to do something about this. And they're probably going to have to introduce export bans on all of these species because there's not enough species-specific data to do non-detriment findings and to introduce sustainable quotas. And that's obviously going to have huge socioeconomic implications for some of these communities. It's also worth mentioning that these negative impacts also make it really hard to get fishermen on board for conservation and sustainability projects because they see conservation as the enemy. It's having negative impacts for them. And then that has knock-on impacts in getting the government engaged because it makes it harder for them to accept additional CITES regulations because they have other things to worry about. It's not just about conservation for them, but it's also about the well-being of their communities and constituency. So what does all of this mean? Well, I don't think the shark and ray industry is going away anytime soon. But there's going to be no one-size-fits-all for protecting and managing sharks and rays. Both practically and ethically, species-focused bans aren't currently working. We need a more nuanced approach. And now I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what WCS is doing in Indonesia to try and deal with some of these issues. So one of our project sites is a targeted shark fishery in Lombok. And we've kind of accepted that that shark fishery is not going anywhere. We're not going to be able to switch all of those shark fishers into doing something else. So instead, we want to try and make that fishery more sustainable. In order to do this, we've been using our 4 years of landings monitoring data to try and inform practical fisheries management regulations. So one example is that we've modelled different types of fishing behaviour against catch and catch per unit effort. And one of our findings is that gear type is actually a significant factor in explaining both the likelihood of catching and the catch per unit effort of endangered species. And what we're now trying to do is build this finding into local and provincial level fisheries management regulations in order to and create incentives for people to switch towards using the less damaging fishing gears. We're also using this data to inform sustainability indicators and to try and ensure that catch is more sustainable. I'm going to skip over this because I've only got 1 minute left, so I'm going to move to the next slide. Moving on to Aceh, we're also trying to use data to inform spatial management. So there's a lot of fisheries in Aceh that are currently catching high numbers of juvenile hammerhead sharks. And this is a sign that there's critical habitat in the area for hammerhead shark nurseries. These fisheries aren't actually targeting hammerheads, they're targeting other species such as white snapper and shrimp. And what we're trying to do is collect data to find out where the critical habitat for hammerhead nursery grounds are, and also find out where are the fishing grounds where fishers can get higher economic returns per unit effort for their target species. And ideally, we want to try and direct fishermen towards more economically valuable fishing grounds and set up marine protected areas for the critical habitat. And hopefully we might even achieve one of these fabled win-win solutions where the fishermen get more money and we achieve conservation outcomes for hammerhead sharks. It's still early days, we're just collecting data, so I'll let you know how that's going at next year's symposium. I've got 2 more slides, is that okay? Okay, and finally, for the most threatened and vulnerable species, in this case manta rays, we're helping the government to protect them. So manta rays are kind of a special case in Indonesia. The fisheries are quite targeted. It's mainly through targeted spear hunting, and they're traded for specific purposes. Their gills are used in traditional Chinese medicine. And in 2014, the Indonesian government declared manta rays a fully protected species throughout Indonesia. And through the work of our amazing Wildlife Crimes Unit, a member of whom is here in the crowd, I'm going to embarrass you, Uni, but I can't see where she is. Through the work of our amazing Wildlife Crimes Unit, we're helping to build awareness, capacity and motivation of the government to deal with marine wildlife crimes. And we're also directly supporting the investigation, arrest and prosecution of illegal wildlife traders. And our monitoring data has shown that since 2014, there's been a significant increase in the fines and prison sentences for traders of illegal shark and ray products, and a significant decrease in landings of manta rays at our 2 case study monitoring sites. So this seems to be a conservation success story. Okay, so just to wrap up. As I've said, I don't believe that shark fishing and trading is going anywhere anytime soon. And we need to move away from a species-focused protection approach towards a more sustainability holistic approach. Within Indonesia, we really need practical fisheries management approaches for ensuring that fisheries are more sustainable, in particular bycatch mitigation in large-scale commercial fisheries. We also need simple, low-cost methods for species-specific trade monitoring within Indonesia. At the moment, because there's no species-specific data, it's impossible to implement traceability systems and implement CITES. And we really need to be able to do sustainable trade quotas for sharks and rays. We also need to better understand consumption within Indonesia. There is considerable demand for shark and ray products in country, and this is probably only going to grow, particularly as tourism is increasing, and particularly with people from China and Hong Kong who traditionally consume lots of shark products are going to be coming to Indonesia. CITES is going to do nothing to regulate this trade, and so we need to better understand demand and consumption in country and develop systems and incentives to ensure that in-country consumption is both responsible and sustainable. And then finally, I'm going to say something quite controversial. I strongly believe that until supply countries like Indonesia have got better systems in place for managing and monitoring their trade, adding additional species to CITES appendices is not going to have much of a trickle-down impact at the level of the fishery, because at the moment these countries have got little to no ability to actually implement these policies. So thank you to everybody for listening. Terima kasih banyak semua, and